Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 581, The Men of Chivalry, Part 1. The last few months have given me much occasion to think about the idea of heroes. You see, when we think about sports, I put it to you that at least some of what we are really talking about is our concept of what a hero is. The pure achievement of it all is, of course, important, being impressed by the athleticism, by the grit, by the determination, but there is a reason that basically every sports movie ends with some form of long-form speech about the importance of character, inspiring us to some sort of universal lesson that is merely grounded in, say, ice hockey, or integration in high school football, or the Jamaican bobsled team. Why yes, I did grow up in the 90s, how can you tell? But, these speeches always tell us, the real point of this whole story is supposed to be about lessons of character that apply on and off the field. Similarly, the burden of the Tsuna, which Akebono felt so heavily upon his promotion, was at its core about character, about a certain notion of what it means to have good character, to be a role model, to inspire others, and a refusal to accept anything less than perfection from yourself. In a somewhat similar way, Miyazaki Manabu was a certain kind of hero for a certain kind of age, or at least he liked to present himself that way. The rebel without a cause, the man opposed to the heartlessness of the system, willing to go to any length, any extreme for those he cared about. The sort of story he crafted out of his own life practically reads like a heroic action movie already. I would hardly be the first person to make what I think is the somewhat basic point that you can learn a lot about a society from who it turns into a hero. And I certainly think we can learn a lot about a certain kind of counterculture, a certain kind of dissatisfaction with the system and the status quo that leads to the elevation of men like Miyazaki Manabu. Similarly, it's a certain kind of very traditionalist view of sumo and of human character in general that privileges the idea of the yokozuna and puts pressure on those that receive the rank to live up to nearly inhuman demands on their physical and mental fortitude. But there is one more place, as I've already said, beyond print, beyond sports, where we look for our heroes, and so, my friends, let's talk about the movies. For the next 3 weeks, I want to take some time to talk about, in particular, two of the more famous film genres in Japanese history, the jidaigeki, or period piece, and the related chivalry film, or ninkyo eiga. And if you haven't heard those terms before, oh boy, my friend, you are in for a treat, but first, of course, while this is not our first time talking about the history of cinema in Japan, we've done it a decent number of times before, it's worth a brief refresher, so let's talk about the history of film. So, the earliest form of film we see in the historical record is the kinetoscope, invented by the great American scientist and only occasional intellectual property thief Thomas Edison. Edison first released the kinetoscope to the public in 1894, and the first projected films in history were put together by the French brothers Auguste and Louis Lumière, whose cinematograph, as they called it, they used to project some scenes of workers in their factories. Contrary to what some may have heard, their film The Arrival of a Train at La Ciotat Station wasn't shown until 1896. It was not, in fact, the first commercially screened film ever. Also, apparently, the Lumière brothers were a bit surprised at how much attention the moving black and white images they made got compared to their other big innovation, some early color photography, thus proving that from the beginning, movie executives had a hell of a time telling what exactly it is the people actually want. Anyway, as early as 1896, Edison's kinetoscope had made it to Japan, followed shortly by the Lumière cinematograph, but for the first decade or so, there wasn't all that much to, actually watch. Most of the earliest films we have from Japan are either what we can loosely call documentaries, basically short recordings of events around the country, from famous landmarks and nightlife in Tokyo to geisha performances in Kyoto, or what you might call culturally edifying productions. We've talked before about Ichikawa Danjuro IX, the great kabuki actor who deigned to record a scene from the play Momijigari for the plebeian masses to see on the silver screen, but only if the film would not be released until after his death. He felt that recording would preserve his brilliance for all posterity, a true gift to the future, but releasing it while he was still alive would cheapen his own greatness somehow. I've watched the scene. I'm not a huge kabuki person, but frankly, I think it's just okay. Anyway, what really changed the status of film as a medium was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. This was the conflict that really saw Japan emerge as a great power on the world stage. It was also the first one in Asia where photographs and even basic film cameras were available in large enough numbers to begin substantially documenting the conflict for newsreel footage. By comparison, the earlier Sino-Japanese War had largely been documented by woodblock prints made by artists who were hearing secondhand accounts of the fighting, very stylized, artistically impressive, not the most accurate. And the chance to see what was really going on was a big draw for theatergoers during the conflict, particularly since the level of national mobilization imposed by the Russo-Japanese War meant that everyone really had a stake in it. Even if you or someone you knew wasn't on the front lines, you were certainly impacted by the rationing and by the higher taxes. This film boom would lay the groundwork for Japan's first film studios. In particular, we usually mark the birth of Japan's film industry at 1908 with a film produced by Makino Shozo, one of the great pioneers of Japanese cinema, in conjunction with his primary stable of actors, a troupe of kabuki players led by Onoe Matsunosuke, who jumped ship over to cinema as the popularity of staged theater was starting to dry up. Just for comparison, Hollywood as we know it didn't really start to come together as the heart of the American film industry until 1911, so Japan's film industry is one of the oldest on the entire planet, and actually we're going to have more to say about Makino and Onoe in a bit, but I do want to mention them briefly here because they're pretty important as pioneers of the overall narrative. Unfortunately, the earliest days of Japanese film history are plagued with a pretty big problem for the historian. Preservation was not really a consideration at that point, and the conditions for it just weren't very good, so very little of cinema from the earliest period of Japanese film history survives for us today. Really, most of what we have are archival records and promotional materials, such as a 1911 pamphlet from Yokota Shokai, which was Makino Shozo's production company, listing out the films they had for sale. Even this limited archive, however, paints a very fascinating tale, because the vast majority of films, even at this early point, are what we would call jidaigeki. So what exactly is a jidaigeki? Again, the term literally means period piece, and in the West, that tends to conjure up images of, say, Jane Austen. In Japan, however, the period in question was the pre-Meiji Restoration era, the age of feudalism, the samurai before westernization. In particular, most, though certainly not all jidaigeki, tend to be set either during the Sengoku Jidai, the age of civil wars in the Warring States era during the 1500s, or the subsequent 250 years of rule by the Tokugawa shoguns. Thus, for example, if we look at that 1911 Yokota Shokai pamphlet, most of the films on it were jidaigeki. Most of them were also fairly short. Film length at this point was measured in feet of film because there was not, to my understanding, yet a standardized frame rate for film, but most were around 200 feet, which at today's standard, 24 frames a second, is about 10 minutes of film time. The longest, an adaptation of the famous kabuki play Chushingura about the revenge drama The 47 Ronin, was 7,000 feet, which is several hours of film. And in fact, that very first film that Makino did in 1908 with his troupe of kabuki actors, well, it was called Honnoji Gassen, the Attack on Honnoji, a stylized version of the history of the death of the warlord Oda Nobunaga, who famously was trapped inside Honnoji by one of his own vassals and then burned alive. Makino is thus arguably the creator of the jidaigeki genre, and that genre in turn is about as old as Japanese cinema itself. It's also incredibly popular. By one count, over 6,000 jidaigeki were made between 1908 and the start of the Pacific War in 1941, representing an average, for those doing the math at home, of just over 181 films a year, or about 15 to 16 jidaigeki coming out every single month. Now you should keep in mind, many of these are not, especially at first, feature-length films like we think of them today, but even so, that's bonkers to think about. From what we can tell, Makino was also the one to coin the term jidaigeki. That we know of, the first time it's used was to advertise one of his films, Ukiyo-eshi, or The Woodcut Artist, which came out in 1923. Makino produced it once he left Yokota Shokai to start his own personal film studio. Now, the popularity of the jidaigeki would wax and wane over time, of course. From what we can tell, the high watermark was during the early interwar period right after the end of World War I. For example, in 1918, of the surviving film releases that we know of, 60% of the year's theatrical releases were jidaigeki. By comparison, the low point was midway through World War II. In 1943, only 20% of films released in theaters were jidaigeki, but to be fair, that's mostly because the war had interrupted filming for the whole industry, and government dictates deprioritized basically anything that wasn't just straight up wartime propaganda by that point. Now, a lot of the production of jidaigeki was driven by quirks from this period in terms of how theaters tended to arrange their release schedules. If you know your film history, you know the way we tend to see movies in the theater today, just going for a single one, is a recent invention. I guess, to be fair, given trends in streaming, going to a theater at all is a bit of an anachronism, and this seems also like a good time to remind you all to support your local independent theater. Anyway, in the early days of film, going to the movies was an all-day affair. You'd have a double feature, usually a higher budget film, the A movie, and a lower budget one, the B movie, shown for a shared price. This is apparently a type of staging approach, 2 showings for the price of 1, that has its roots in the history of theater and opera, but that's not a subject I know that well. In Japan specifically, it became common for double features to pair a jidaigeki, a period piece, with a gendaigeki, a modern piece, in other words, a drama set in the present day. More often than not, the jidaigeki were the cheaper filler fare. It wasn't that hard to throw together a functional set and find some fake swords and costumes to throw on, and in particular, children's programming appears to have included a lot of jidaigeki. Of course, again, I do have to say appears here. A lot of our surviving repository of pre-World War II films in general is just woefully small, particularly when it comes to films from the silent era. And by the way, as an aside, I also want to note Japan's silent era lasted a lot longer than that of Hollywood, where the silent era really started to end in 1927 with The Jazz Singer, the first talkie. It was largely over by the early 30s. In Japan, the silent era lasted until the late 30s, primarily due to the cultural role of the narrator, or benshi, in Japanese film. The benshi is a role inherited from pre-modern theater in Japan, pre-film theater, most notably the comedic storytelling form known as rakugo. Silent films were accompanied by live performers who would describe the scene, adding their own spin on things, essentially riffing off the material on screen, with a combination of pre-scripted notes that came with the film and their own unique additions. Not everyone loved the benshi as a concept. As early as 1915, groups of so-called pure film enthusiasts vocally critiqued the practice as an out-of-date holdover from Japanese theater. They also disliked another holdover from earlier theater forms, the reliance on onnagata, male kabuki actors who were trained to play women instead of actual female actors. They did succeed in getting rid of onnagata in film by the mid-20s, but the benshi remained popular for a lot longer, which is also why talkies as a genre took longer to catch on in Japan. But anyway, much, though thankfully not all of the production of this silent era running through the 30s, is lost to us. Again, partially it's a matter of preservation. The idea of preserving film for posterity wasn't really a consideration until the industry had begun to mature, particularly by the 1930s, when it had become common to argue that film was an art form akin to painting or literature, and that it deserved to be preserved for posterity, not just schlocky stuff designed to make a quick buck. That mindset is an issue in terms of film preservation in general in early history, but there are also some problems unique to Japan. For example, the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 devastated central Japan, which was home to much of the nation's film industry, and early film itself was notoriously prone to water damage and also extremely flammable, since much of Japan's climate is very wet, and the heavily wooden and paper construction favored before the war meant most of the buildings that film studios used were also very flammable. Well, you can guess how that went, and that's not even getting into the issue of World War II firebombings, which gutted most of the major cities of the country, the places where the film studios were. The few reels that survive to us also tend to be in pretty bad shape, because to keep costs down, studios generally made only a few prints of each movie and then shipped them around the country to be rescreened until they literally fell apart from the wear and tear, and in the case of a sequel or film series, they would often recut or edit older films into the newer ones with little regard for preserving the old prints. The general feeling among Japanese film execs in this early period was that the domestic Japanese film market was for less discerning younger audiences, and thus really nothing of merit was being produced that was worth preserving. More sophisticated adults, it was felt, would flock to foreign productions. So, for example, remember Makino Shozo, that pioneering director who created some of the first Japanese films in 1908? He was not in the film business to be an auteur making high art to edify the masses. He was from a merchant family in Kyoto and saw film mostly as a way to make money. He keyed in on film as a financial opportunity more than anything else, and ended up working primarily with the kabuki actor Onoe Matsunosuke as his star, not because he thought that highly of Onoe as an actor, but because of Onoe's talent for something he thought would sell well on screen, called tachimawari. Tachimawari is the stylized fight choreography used in kabuki, usually involving a hero against multiple opponents, though one-on-one fights do happen on occasion. It involves some pretty over-the-top acrobatics, defeated enemies tend to go flying into somersaults, and the hero does a lot of what are called mie, essentially action poses. It's a big part, at least in my view, of the visual spectacle of kabuki, and part of what gives it the energy the form is famous for. And of course, Makino was right that it translated well onto the silver screen, and Onoe, after his film debut, would go on to star in about 1,000 more films before his death in 1928. Again, much of those were a lot shorter than the feature film today, but still, that's a pretty incredible resume. Now, already by the late 1920s, there was a move away from pure kabuki tachimawari fighting and towards something more realistic, but stylized sword fights are, of course, if you're at all familiar with samurai movies, still very common, as are the various action poses descended from kabuki mie, even if they're not quite as over-the-top as they used to be. What didn't translate as well as the action, Makino Shozo noticed, was the typical kabuki plot. The stock warrior archetype in kabuki does a lot of badass butt-kicking, but he also does a lot of agonizing moralizing about the application of his abstract values of honor, filial piety, personal loyalty, all that stuff, to complicated situations. It's the sort of thing that works well in more dramatic films today, especially longer feature films, but again, these early ones were pretty short, and regardless, Makino and most other domestic Japanese studios saw their job mostly as making films for kids. And so Makino began to move his productions away from kabuki plots and towards ones lifted from kodan, a type of storytelling based very loosely on the Buddhist tradition that then evolved into more of a popular entertainment genre. Unlike kabuki, kodan stories were intended to have clear, easily digestible plots and narratives that were intended to be entertaining while still having straightforward moral lessons. And because kodan storytelling was very popular before the Meiji Restoration, and also after, people tended to be familiar with the plots. They had favorite characters they would pay to see on screen. Kodan-style narratives would in turn have a big impact on how early jidaigeki were structured, and considering that these early jidaigeki were mostly made for young people, a few of whom would then go on to make post-war jidaigeki, they had a big lingering impact on the entire genre and on samurai film as a whole. In their excellent essay on the history of the samurai film, Lisa Spalding and David Dresser sum up the impact of the kodan-style narrative, first pioneered by Makino Shozo, pretty clearly. Quote, "The Meiji Restoration of 1868 marked the end of feudal Japan, but did not entail a rejection of virtues central to the feudal value system. Honor, filial piety, loyalty, and righteousness continued to be held in high esteem, but were gradually manipulated to inculcate nationalism and ultimately to propagate militarism. These virtues, embodied by legendary samurai and plebeian folk heroes, formed the ideological backbone of the early period film. The young audiences were familiar with the stories adapted for the screen and reared on the values the stories reflected. They were apparently satisfied with simplistic plots that drew clear distinctions between good and evil, and offered ample opportunities for the righteous hero to display his superhuman strength through stupendous feats of swordsmanship. The pair then go on to highlight some of the themes these early jidaigeki were known for, and if you know anything about the later history of the samurai period film, you'll notice right away there's a lot of continuity, let's call it. For starters, of course, the themes of honor and vengeance are constant throughout. A lot of that has to do, to be fair, with the source material early jidaigeki were starting with. Adapting first kabuki plays, then kodan stories to the silver screen meant that a few existing favorite narratives were among the first to make it to theaters, and in particular, two stories were near constant fodder for the big screen. The first is the famous tale of the Soga brothers. We did an episode on them before, episode 282, but for a quick refresh, the brothers Soga Goro and Soga Juro lost their father at a young age in a family dispute with another samurai family, the perpetrator of their father's death also happening to be a close ally of the first shogun, Minamoto no Yoritomo. The brothers spent over a decade plotting their vengeance before, in 1193, ambushing and killing their target while he was out hunting with Yoritomo on the slopes of Mount Fuji. One brother died in the fighting, the other was executed by the shogun's order shortly thereafter, but their vengeance was complete. Now, how true the tale of the Soga brothers is disputed. There are two main sources for it, the Azuma Kagami, the history of the first shogunate, and a specific narrative of their story called the Soga Monogatari, but both are different in places, and at any rate, neither was written with an eye towards pure historical accuracy. But of course, that doesn't matter that much, it's a great story. And so the tale of the Soga brothers was told and retold for centuries to come. The other major source adapted by Makino and early jidaigeki pioneers like him was, of course, Chushingura, probably the single most famous samurai narrative in Japan's history, also known as the Tale of the 47 Ronin. Now, this is a story we've talked about before, most recently episode 527 as a part of our revised introduction to Japanese history, so again, I'm not going to go back over it in detail. The short version is that in 1701, the feudal lord of one of Japan's domains, Ako Domain, was ordered to commit suicide after fighting with another lord inside the palace of the Tokugawa shogun, during the course of which he drew a blade, which is forbidden anywhere in the shogun's palace. Why exactly the fight happened, that's been hotly contested ever since. What is not contested is that in the aftermath of said Lord of Ako's death, his domain was confiscated by the shogunate and given to somebody else, thus, among other things, disenfranchising the samurai of that domain, who now found themselves without a master or income, and subject to a government order not to seek revenge against the man their lord had fought. But 47 of these samurai, now Ronin, masterless warriors, avoided the usual fate of such men becoming bandits or getting involved in organized crime. Instead, they spent 2 years hatching a revenge plot until the man their lord had quarreled with let his guard down, after which time they ambushed him inside his home in Edo, what's now Tokyo, in 1703. Cutting off his head, they presented it to the grave of their long-deceased lord and then turned themselves into the law. 46 of the 47 were eventually ordered to commit suicide for violating the order against seeking revenge, though in recognition of their bravery and loyalty, they were allowed honorable suicide instead of being executed, as criminals usually were. Both tales are, of course, revenge narratives that are very thrilling, and both were, because of that, adapted for kabuki and kodan stories and books and stage shows and puppet plays and basically every form of entertainment in Japan that existed even before film. And as such, by the time film was becoming a thing, the early 20th century, they were already famous and very well-known stories. I guess the equivalent would be something like Robin Hood or King Arthur in terms of position in the cultural consciousness. The stories also fit the demands of audiences and the taste of government censors as well. To return to the words of Lisa Spalding and David Dressler, quote, "Neither the Soga brothers nor the Ako Ronin were involved in the incidents that precipitated the necessity of a vendetta, but they assumed responsibility out of a sense of loyalty or filial piety. As righteous samurai, they placed honor above personal concerns and persisted until they accomplished their purpose. Although the death of the protagonist was not an essential element of the vendetta narrative, the fate of the Soga brothers in the Akko Ronin is representative of a predilection on the part of the period film for narratives that culminate in the hero's demise. On a pragmatic level, the hero represents an unpardonable threat to authority, and his death thus resolves the conflict between the demands of the samurai code of ethics and the obligation of the shogun to maintain political stability. In other words, the revenge drama itself was exciting, but the fate of the protagonists, that they always ended up dead, also helped avoid any potentially controversial read about the film's stories in terms of, say, challenging the legitimacy of the law itself. Of course, it wasn't just the stories of the Soga brothers and the 47 Ronin that made the big screen during this time, even if they were there a lot, the 47 Ronin in particular. I have seen estimates on average of one new 47 Ronin movie during the pre-war period every 18 months or less, though given the preservation issues, again, that's more of a guess than anything else. But there were other subgenres of this period as well, for example, the torimono, essentially samurai cop movies, since during the feudal era, the samurai class was also responsible for law enforcement. Then you have the oye sodo, conflicts between the great houses, in other words, retellings of famous struggles between samurai families throughout history. This would be, for example, where your battles between the famous warlords Uesugi Kenshin and Takeda Shingen would slot in, if you know that commonly drawn from well. Then you have the more niche genres, for example, the samurai investigative drama. Many of these were in turn based on older Tokugawa-era kodan, and were clearly influenced by the moral standards of the time. In particular, the pre-modern government of the Tokugawa shoguns had reserved the right to censor entertainment it considered corrosive to public morality, and said all stories should hew to the principle of kanzen choaku, the rewarding of good and the punishing of evil, so that impressionable commoners would take away the correct sort of lessons that crime does not pay. And these investigative dramas reflected that idea in spades. One of the more popular subjects for those stories was Tokugawa Mitsukuni, a real-life figure from the early days of the shogunate, who was also the grandson of the shogunate's founder Tokugawa Ieyasu. Mitsukuni was the daimyo, or feudal lord, of Mito domain in northern Japan, and is famous among other things for promoting Confucianism in his holdings. This is where the Mito school of Confucian scholars, who were very intellectually influential down the line, comes from. He was also just generally considered to be a very good ruler, apparently. In these stories, Tokugawa Mitsukuni was often referred to as Mito Komon. Mito is of course a reference to the domain he governed. Komon, literally Yellow Gate, is a reference to one of his titles in the convoluted bureaucracy of the time. And shortly after his death, fictionalized accounts of Mitsukuni's exploits began to circulate in kodan stories. These usually revolved around Mitsukuni post-retirement, posing as a commoner and wandering around the countryside, discovering various types of unrighteous criminal activity, solving the crimes, and then dramatically revealing who he was, and laying down some righteous kanzen choaku, punishing of bad and rewarding of good. The Mito Komon stories were so popular that they didn't just survive the transition to film. After the war, they were the subject of a jidaigeki TV series that ran on primetime from 1969 to 2011. Listeners might also remember, as another example of this genre, the real-life figure of Oka Tadasuke, a magistrate who served at the pleasure of the shogun in Edo as one of the two city magistrates and who became this sort of legendary crime-fighting figure. His stories, similarly, were adapted for the silver screen. Then you have even narrower genres, the supernatural thriller with samurai battling monsters from myth and legends, the biographies of the great samurai figures. Miyamoto Musashi, the famous duelist, was a popular choice, as was Sakamoto Ryoma, one of the activists who helped bring down feudalism and to usher in the new imperial government. Sakamoto in particular became a popular choice after a rumor began to circulate that the wife of the Meiji Emperor, Empress Shoken, had a vision in a dream about him. It was probably one of those films that would help inspire the later writer Shiba Ryotaro to write his epic 3-part series about Sakamoto, which in turn is a lot of the basis of his current-day fame. This is also the period where you get the very first Yakuza movies, which really appear as a subgenre of the jidaigeki, and which establish some of the more key aspects of the genre from the jump. The earliest Yakuza films were about a sort of stock character archetype, not just in Japan, but in the wider world, the thief with a heart of gold. Of course, that's not unique to Japan at all. Robin Hood is a classic example, and in a more modern silver screen context, Han Solo is probably one of the most famous incarnations of that trope ever. At the start of the 20th century, thanks again to pre-modern popular culture, especially Kodan, two figures from Japan's own history tended to be the most popular example of this type of character. The first was Nezumi Kozo, a thief from the late 1700s and early 1800s, who was infamous for targeting the homes of the wealthy and powerful, quite literally stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Supposedly, when he was finally caught in 1831, he confessed to stealing from 100 different homes, but had no money to be confiscated because he'd given all the cash to the poor to ensure that it couldn't be returned to the undeserving. He also divorced his wife right before being captured, since, given the laws of the time, she would have been held responsible for his crimes too. The second popular figure was Kunisada Chuji, a bakuto or gambler, similarly with said heart of gold, who committed no shortage of crimes. Indeed, running a gambling den itself was a criminal offense during the feudal period, but who lived by a code, trying to protect others from corrupt officials, standing up to the exploitative, all that jazz. Now, both these people were real, but I think it's fair to say the narratives we have about them are not totally trustworthy, let's say that. As we've seen during our investigations of Tokugawa period literature, it wasn't that unusual for writers to be inspired by events in the news of the day, and then just take those narratives and run with them, adding and removing things to make for, in their view, a more compelling story. And particularly in the case of figures like Nezumi Kozo and Kunisada Chuji, the fictionalized version has so totally overshadowed anything from the real life of the man himself that sorting truth from fiction really is not possible. But of course, that doesn't really matter for us. What matters is that the stories were famous and popular, and they had good morals. The main characters were still outlaws, but good-hearted ones, and both men's stories ended the same way. They were caught and executed for their crimes. In other words, the role of the authorities in upholding this whole unequal system these men were protesting, never questioned. Indeed, some of the films of the 1920s resolved this sort of tension between the seeming justice of the outlaws' cause and the legal questionability of their deeds by having both the lead outlaw and his eventual captor being played by the same actor. By the late 1920s, the basic pattern of the jidaigeki and all its subgenres had largely been set. In fact, the narrative patterns were so set that you also start to see movies deliberately making fun of the tropes of jidaigeki or lampshading them, which is a fancy way of saying you draw attention to the trope by making fun of it. There are a few different examples of this. My personal favorite is from a director named Itami Mansaku, who made a series of what you might call comedic jidaigeki in the 30s. One of these is Kokushi Muso, very roughly the peerless man or the greatest man in the world. The narrative is about a great swordsman known only as Ise no Kami, the protector of Ise province, who meets a vagabond who is pretending to be him in order to enjoy the perks of Ise no Kami's reputation. Naturally, a duel takes place, and the imposter defeats the real thing. So Ise no Kami goes off to the mountains to train to perfect his skills, and then he loses again, at which point his daughter also ditches him to run off with the imposter. Unfortunately, the film does not survive. The script does, with Ise no Kami acting furious because the imposter doesn't understand what he's supposed to be doing. Ise no Kami is the main character. He is supposed to win. So the fact that, quote, the person in the right was beaten by the person in the wrong, unquote, that's just unacceptable. To which the imposter replies, quote, now wait a minute, the person in the right doesn't win, the person who wins is right. Which seems like a good moment to segue into World War II era jidaigeki and the post-war period, but we'll save that for next week. For now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com. You can also support the network on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for part 2.